All right, good afternoon. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about selection. My attention span, admittedly, is short, so I'm going to give you the whole talk in under a minute, and then you can kind of fade in or out as you see fit. So the first part is I'm going to tell you about some selection failures that I've personally had, mainly to do with afros, astronauts, and guide dog puppies. I'm going to give you 3 selection criteria that our service strives to implement, and that has to do mainly with, on the one hand, selecting for character. On the X, we select for diversity, and then we try to select for everyone for leadership. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about leadership and why we think that's so important in all of our team, and that's around a couple of things, and mainly actually well emulated by Halden just there, and that has to do with fire in the belly. It has to do a little bit with intellectual horsepower, but particularly with what we call learning agility. All right, so that said, you can settle in. Let's look at some slides. Just by way of disclosure, I'm Canadian, originally born and bred, spent a year in South Australia, which was superb, and have now been with my family in Auckland, New Zealand this is our 8th year, and it's a beautiful place, which you should all come to visit. I think it's important that we clarify, and this has been talked about a little bit already today, what selection is and why selection is important. And I want to draw a distinction between recruitment, which is also important, screening, which is important, and selection, which is to make an assumption that there are more people interested in working for the service that you have than you would have spots. And so for our service, like I think many of the people that work in this room, it would be characterized by high stakes, moderately high hazard environments where healthcare is being provided in interdisciplinary teams. And so we have to think a little bit about how can we do that. And this is the traditional model. And if you can remember, for some of you, Ben Affleck back in Good Will Hunting, you submit your package of paperwork, ideally you're shortlisted, you sit in for your interview, and if that goes well, there might be a reference check. And I think that is the model that our service has used and continues to use. So it's not to say that that model isn't without benefit, but I think there is an opportunity to consider, if we're thinking about the future, how do we select for the right stuff? And so I'm going to take a couple of slides to talk about athletics. This would be Eliza McCartney. She's a New Zealander that won bronze medal in the Rio Olympics for the pole vault. If you talk to coaches when they select, they would say, well, performance is a mixture of capability, but also behavior. And I think as we're trying to think about how we would select, we're not bad at looking at capability, and I think increasingly we can merge that with behavior as well. And again, for those of you not from this part of the world, the All Blacks are a reasonably successful rugby team based in New Zealand. What they do, and this is basically on their dressing room wall, they would say, we expect as a prerequisite you will come with intelligence, and you will come with strength, and you will come with speed. What they're interested in is whether you're coming with character. And I think this is where I'd like to spend a bit of time, is how does one select for character? And so here's where the stories kick in. So afros, this is a bit of public humiliation. So when I applied 25 years ago for medical school, this was the photo that I appended to my application. And I think it was probably done in a bit of defiance as to why a first impression should matter, but I can tell you my parents were unimpressed. Below that is our current guide dog. His name's Yuma, so we train guide dogs for the blind. And I wanted to tell you a bit about the canine mindset of process versus outcome. And then we'll spend a couple of minutes now talking about astronaut recruitment. So 10 years ago, they put an ad in the newspaper, in the Globe and Mail, saying, interested applicants for the Canadian Space Agency, please submit your application. And so along with 5,000 other odd Canadians, I thought, well, that's not a bad idea. So away we went. And if you're interested, you can click to sort of see how it is, but you can imagine they had quite a large funnel from which to take 2 Canadian astronauts, one of whom is actually currently in space as we speak. I think this is a powerful, somewhat blunt statement, but the purpose in large part was to weed out the dreamers. And so they did this by a variety of techniques, but one of the ones that we've taken upon is absolute standardization. And that is, to give you an example, for all of those candidates selected for an interview, they were video conference interviews. So whether you were in the room working with a space agency already, whether you were deployed, the Canadians at that point were in Kandahar in Afghanistan, video conference, and that was used as a countermeasure for bias. And then they started to put you through sort of assessment, weeks. There were blocks where people would do different activities. The first ones are around individual performance. And again, you can think about both mental and physical attributes. They looked a little bit at psychological assessments, personality inventories. But the performance they were interested in was the performance under pressure. And this is, again, a phrase the All Blacks use quite a lot. They'll talk about walking towards the pressure, embracing the pressure. And so they put us into teams, not dissimilar to the teams we might find ourselves in a pre-hospital environment. So quite disparate in terms of backgrounds, disciplines, probably mindset. And the thing they wanted to see was, how would you confront uncertainty? How would you manage complexity? What was it? How could you quickly and creatively, with a group of strangers, come up with a potential solution to a challenge? And it was also looking at technical skills, but also the non-technical skills. And you can imagine that whereas a pilot, he or she may have a dexterity in flying an aircraft, that could be a different skill set for managing conflict within a group. But the part that was powerful, and again, that we've tried to put into our own service, is this concept of, well, how do you make assessments? And what I thought was quite rich is that they would ask you, they'd say, well, how did you perform there? And then they'd ask a lot of you on the team and say, well, how did you guys think that he performed or she performed? And so you'd rank order the people you were with. And then they'd look at people within the service, so current and also past astronauts, which you can see sort of behind me down to the left. And then beyond that, and what was interesting is the folks with the red caps who actually had no skin in the game. Their only job was to make sure that the application, the testing was done fairly and without cause for concern. In some ways, almost like a probity umpire. And the goal, as we mentioned, was quite clear. But interestingly, if you've ever read the book or seen the movie The Right Stuff, the goal of human spaceflight right now is all around long duration missions and very little to do with the idea of just suborbital flight as per the original Mercury flights. And so if we come back to Earth, so I did not make it as an astronaut, surprise. The part that's interesting to me is our own mission profile within our rescue helicopter service has changed. And so if you had started with our service in the 1970s, your swimming ability, in some ways your rescue skills, were tantamount. And now what we're looking for, again, the ability to provide early, safe, optimal patient care in this interdisciplinary environment where you're inserting a critical care team by a variety of means. So we select for these three criteria. We are interested in character, diversity, and leadership. And the diversity part, and this is a group of our fellows, and currently just to say our fellows are from Kenya, from Scotland, and from Canada. So the diversity continues. We believe strongly in the cross-pollination that was described earlier this morning, and a lot to do about how different backgrounds, different specializations can contribute to the service growing, often in ways we didn't even expect. I think they're the building blocks for success. And so what I would say is, we're trying, and I had a conversation at lunch with one of the Sydney paramedics, to think about, well, how can we move these selection tools, these scenarios upstream? And at this stage, we're starting to develop a high potential candidate pool, some of whom are actually in this room, of people who haven't yet even applied, but whom we're trying to mentor towards this goal. These are the qualities I described. So again, fire in the belly, intellectual horsepower, learning agility. But to be honest, and I'll leave you with this, I think we need to confront that there are barriers. We don't have the means to do this without thinking creatively. So I'll turn it over for questions. Thank you.
Craig Wiley, SmackForce News. Hello, Chris.
You're getting into role, I can feel that.
I just had to bring it back. Thank you, Chris. So what we're really talking about here is getting a job, right? I'm just getting myself on to speed here. But you said very early, there's a difference between recruitment and selection. There's a difference between just applying for a job, sitting in an interview, and what selection really is. What do you see that difference to be?
Well, I think they're interdependent. And by that I mean, if we get this right, what we should have is a pool of interested candidates and a service which is appealing. So it sounds a little bit like dating, but I think we're trying to create a climate where people are excited to come and work for you. They see value, but equally the service should be able to identify that value. But I think the recruitment piece is a lot around branding. Some people talk about networking. To us, as I said, I see it as about creating a pool of talent. It's almost like building a football club or a soccer club and wanting to be able to kind of, whether they end up playing for you or they play for a different club, they'll be successful.
Great. And then obviously with dating, we need two interesting parties. How do we as clinicians decide where to apply, which critical retrieval system or which ambulance service would we actually want to go work for?
Yeah. I think the honest answer is a lot of people, it's proximity. I'm close to you, so I'm going to find out what you're about. But I think if you had the spectrum in front of you, some of the things that we consider are case mix. So whether you have more of an interest in a certain transport platform or a certain mission type. It also may be that you're trying to train your limiter. So you may be working with several services as part of trying to balance out, as we heard from the trauma surgeon, building on skills that you don't yet have. I think the other part is, what's the stage of growth, or if you will, development. So the service that I work for is very much in a growth phase. So people are going to have to be comfortable with that uncertainty in a way they might choose to sit more with a mature, better evolved organization.
Okay, great, thanks. Then the last question, and this is a bugbear of mine, is that you often make mistakes in terms of selection. You don't get the right fit. How do you guys measure your selection process, that your selection process is actually successful, essentially?
So it is quasi-scientific. I think there is a certain amount of, do we still get along? So you can look at the HR measures of, is there retention? So I suppose that's one model. One you can look at is just, what is, I suppose, the cultural strength of the organization? So is it growing? Are people, in fact, in training to want to be part of it? We can look at patient outcomes, but that's an indirect measure with all sorts of confounders. So I think this is going to take some time. It's actually quite interesting to look at whether there could be some sort of case crossover design where we could start to see, and you can see it in the United Kingdom now, where for the UK prehospital emergency medicine group, they're having national selections starting to compare. So I guess I'd like to see some science being brought to on this.
Okay. And then just in terms of myself, I just want to see, do you have a cool helicopter? I might send my application in. Thank you. Craig Wiley signing off for Smack Force News.